Thank you, John. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. What I just said was, may peace and the blessings and mercy of God be with all of you. This is the universal Muslim greeting. I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Catholic Christian, but for what I hope are obvious reasons, I find those words very easily flowing from my lips. There's a favorite saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Man la yashkur nas la yashkur Allah, which translates something like, whoever fails to express gratitude to his or her fellow human beings cannot hope to express gratitude to God. So I would like to join my voice to John's and begin my expression of gratitude with acknowledgement of country, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, traditional custodians of this land, and the elders, both past and present, who teach us the importance of being in relationships of integrity with one another, and not only with one another as human beings, but with all of creation. And who also teach us very sharply what happens when we neglect the maintenance of the integrity of those relationships. I also want to begin by thanking Affinity Intercultural Foundation, our hosts this morning, especially my uncle, Ahmed Polat. Where is Ahmed? Is he here? I don't know. And the advisory board members of AIF. And of course, I want to thank Professor Ormerod of the Australian Catholic University and John Cleary for agreeing to respond and facilitate respectively. I would be remiss if I didn't thank the many anonymous volunteers who I know have worked so hard behind the scenes in quiet humility to make an afternoon like this possible. So thank you to all of you. And I realize it sounds cliche, but it's no less true to say how grateful I am that all of you have taken the time to be here this afternoon. There are so many forces of social entropy at work these days that I believe it's an even more sacred act than usual to come together for fellowship and exchange of ideas as we're proposing to do this afternoon. Before proceeding any further, I probably should say that I'm truly humbled for a few reasons. I'm feeling humbled by my body. Just yesterday I recovered from a fever. My body is saying, really, Scott, after we've been through the past week or so, all we've been through this past week, first flying in that aluminum tube, through numerous time zones, and only recently recovering from this bothersome microbe, you're standing before a group of intelligent folks and proposing to put more than 2 coherent sentences together. Are you totally insane or even more arrogant than I thought? But that isn't half as bad as what my mind is saying. My mind is saying, really, Scott, you've traveled all the way to this gorgeous country on a so-called speaking tour, and thus on the utterly false premise that you have something to offer its people, when you know quite well it is they who have far more to offer you. But luckily, there's my heart, and it's saying to my body and mind, really, do I have to listen to you guys have it out again? Let's just all relax, do our best, and see where it all goes. So that's what I'm going to do. John did a great job at giving you a little preview into what I'm going to be talking with today in these remarks entitled "Dealing with Difference, Peril or Promise." I hope I get due credit for the alliteration. It took me a little while to sort of cook that up. I'm going to start with a meteorological metaphor. I'm going to say something about a great and strange fog in mythic Arthurian England and the contemporary United States, from which I hail. I'll say something about the somewhat counterintuitive nature of this fog and what happens when this peculiar fog starts to lift, how differences come into clearer focus when the fog lifts, and yet how the essence of difference remains sorely unperceived. I'll talk about how we see peril where we ought to see promise. And finally, I'll cycle back to our hosts this afternoon and the deeply admirable global movement of which they are a vital part. I'll share with you my joy that these people who see the promise, not the peril of difference, are here to contribute to a society committed to this same way of seeing things. So this is my second time in Australia. Haven't been able to do as much touring, as maybe many folks who come from the United States to Australia are able to do because I've been on this speaking tour. I'm telling you that because I want to apologize for whatever offense my ignorance of the Australian context, or Australian contexts, probably more accurately, will cause. I have a colleague who once talked about intercultural experience as one of walking in other people's gardens. You don't really know where people have planted the precious flowers, and where you might be stepping on something that you shouldn't step upon. You can't sometimes even recognize what might be considered a weed from what might blossom into a beautiful bush or shrub or flower. So you have to take your cues from your hosts. But more importantly, I offer this just as de facto justification for speaking to you out of the context I know best, and even then in a fragmented way, which would be the contemporary United States. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to take you back with me to Sunday, November 13th, 2016. It was the first Sunday after the election of Donald J. Trump as the 45th President of the United States. Ever since the early morning hours of the previous Wednesday, what some of us have come to call 11/9, there were stark differences in the reaction of the people. Many U.S. Americans were elated, some in my own extended family and hometown. Most of the people I know, however, from my own professional community and neighborhood on Chicago's South Side were either sanguine, disappointed once again, but not surprised at all, or some combination of angry, incredulous, devastated, shocked, and confused. My one solace on that Sunday was that I was headed to church to listen to my favorite preacher, a Capuchin friar and liturgical theologian who's a dear colleague and friend by the name of Father Ed Foley. Father Foley began his homily by confessing how, quote, unenthusiastic, end quote, he was about being in the pulpit that morning, after what had been for so many, quote, such a shocking and chaotic week, end quote. And many in the congregation nodded sympathetically. And then, much to my surprise and secret delight, he made reference to a novel we had both recently read, Kazuo Ishiguro's The Buried Giant. The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. He's a British author of Japanese descent. Foley recounted how the novel, set in mythical post-Arthurian England, begins by introducing readers to the central pair of protagonists, Axel and Beatrice, an elderly couple who are suffering, along with everyone they know, from a barely perceptible loss of long-term memory. This gnawing communal amnesia of which Axel is becoming increasingly aware is not associated with dementia, but rather with a strange fog, which has settled over the entire countryside sometime after the death of Arthur, who defended the Britons from the Saxon invaders, and yet who somehow was able to establish a Briton-Saxon peace after the great bloodshed of the conflict between the two. Through this mnemonic fog, Axel is able to remember a son who lives in a distant village, and he manages to convince Beatrice to journey with him on a quest to reunite the family. Along the way, the couple meets another pair, a Saxon warrior and an aging Briton knight and nephew of Arthur, who gradually discover that they are mortal enemies, not despite, but precisely because of the nature of the Arthurian peace between their two peoples. We learn that this peace was not forged over time in the anguish-fueled furnace of truth and reconciliation, but rather almost instantly through the magic of a dragon whom Merlin enchanted to spew the fog of its amnesia-inducing breath over the very countryside that witnessed the horrors of Briton-Saxon warfare, and especially Arthur's role as ruthless warlord and slaughterer of innocents. The Saxon has been charged with slaying the dragon, so the fog will entirely dissipate, while the Arthurian knight is its sworn protector. Both eventually realize that the reason Axel was beginning to regain his memory is that the dragon was dying anyway. In Father Foley's words, quote, "The dragon's breath is the fog that induces this societal amnesia, dampening the memories of hatred and slaughter, rivalry and division that grew out of Arthur's bloody conquest of the Saxons. And so there was a Camelot of sorts, but more a Camelotic mask, a Camelotic ruse. And once the dragon is slain, memory returns. A memory that will once again feed a smoldering anger between Britons and Saxons, and a memory that will feed smoldering doubts between Axel and his beloved Beatrice. Memory is the buried giant here. And when it raises its fiendish head, personal division and societal chaos ensue." End quote. The point this master preacher went on to make is that the results of the 2016 presidential election was something akin to the slaying of the dragon. He offered the insight that the 16-month election season did not so much create as expose in bold relief profound pre-existing divisions in the body politic of the United States. In some ways, I agree with Father Foley. A certain layer of fog was lifted, enough at least to see each other a bit more clearly through the haze. But what I would add is that in no way has it lifted enough for us to see who we are as a society in the clear light of day. To return to Ishiguro's metaphor, the dragon's breathing has become a bit more shallow, and thus the output of fog that much less. But the dragon is still alive, inhaling the realities of our history and exhaling its amnesic mist, as it has been from the time the first settlers from Europe arrived on our shores in the United States. Basically, what I'm trying to allude to here is that there's a connection between the amnesic fog and a dominant national narrative that pretends that so many of the crimes that were part and parcel of the building of the nation known as the United States pretends that the effects of those crimes in some ways didn't really happen, or if one were to admit they did, their effects are no longer with us. And of course, they certainly are. So, if I'm agreeing with Father Foley that the fog has lifted a little bit, and that we can see ourselves a little more clearly, what can we see, and what is still shrouded? Well, I think we see difference a bit more clearly. We see it all around us and recognize it and acknowledge that it's deeper and broader than we might have thought. When I went back to my hometown of Revere, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston in the northeast of the United States, in January, just before the inauguration, to see my parents, I went to a gym there, and were it not for the election, I don't think I would have noticed this coming from Chicago, but, and were it not for the fact that I was recently with a relative who was a great supporter of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's sort of nativist agenda, I guess I wouldn't have noticed it. But because of these things I did, I walked into the men's locker room, and I was just beginning to notice what people were saying and beginning to notice that I didn't understand what a lot of people were saying. Why? Because I'm not fluent in Portuguese, and there were 3 guys speaking Portuguese. They were Brazilian immigrants. And I certainly don't know any Mandarin Chinese, and there was a guy, I think it was Mandarin, it sounded Mandarin to me, on the phone, talking in Chinese. And then there were 2 guys speaking Spanish. My Spanish is not that good, and I didn't understand what they were saying. There were a couple of old gents speaking Italian. That's my immigrant stock. So I actually know a little Italian. I understood what they were saying and actually eventually started talking with them. And the only 3 people speaking English in the gym, that's what I eventually did understand, were African Americans. And when I was growing up in Revere, Massachusetts, you would never find an African American within 20 miles of the city limits. So it gave me a little insight into my relative who supported Donald Trump. This relative is a very good person, and interpersonally, no matter what a person's skin color or faith, if they were broken down by the side of the road, he would stop and give that person his last dime to try to help them ameliorate their situation. But that same relative, where he'd walk into that locker room, would say, "What happened to my country?" Right? This is not the country I grew up in. People are sort of taking it away from me. That's overly simplistic, but the idea is that people of all kinds are seeing the differences, I think, a little more clearly because of this fog lifting a little bit that I'm associating with the election of Donald Trump. But what is it that we still don't see? Why do I resist the idea that this fog has lifted entirely? Well, even gatherings like this one, gatherings which presumably are intentional about celebrating difference, oftentimes are not about celebrating the differences we see at all, but rather attempting to lasso these differences, rein them in, domesticate them, make them more palatable, even enjoyable. We almost instinctively see the peril of difference and have a hard time perceiving its promise. How many times have you heard what I like to call, what John made reference to, the sameness platitude? That pragmatic and well-intentioned phrase, "We are all more alike than we are different." We've all said it. Come on, don't feel guilty. I'm not attacking you if you've said this, The question is, are we? Anthropologists like Clifford Geertz have been telling us for years that as creatures who are relatively low on instinct and relatively high on cultural programming, one of the characteristics we Homo sapiens sapiens have most in common with one another is precisely the capacity to be so radically different from one another. If I just were to gloss Geertz's insight on this, I think he would say, giraffes just don't have, kangaroos just don't have the capacity to be radically different from each other. Their behavior is programmed, instinctually, and even the language that they speak, right, is programmed instinctually. But you only think of the stunning pluriformity of human language and the elemental role language plays in continually shaping and giving life to culture to see Geertz's point. Nearly every human infant is born with the capacity for verbal linguistic expression, yet no baby is born either thinking or speaking the human language. Nor is any infant born speaking Mandarin or Spanish or Navajo or Twi or Turkish. Rather, all are born ready to download over the course of a few years the linguistic operating system of her or his family, village, and region, her or his immediate cultural context. If we move from anthropology to sacred scripture, we find indications that this should come as no surprise to us, that we were created in and for difference. In particular, I'm thinking of the words beautifully and powerfully expressed in the Quranic verse found in Surah Al-Hujurat, number 13, verse 13. Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila li ta'arafu. Inna akramakum 'inda Allahi atqakum, inna Allaha alimun khabir. God, speaking in the first person, says, "O humanity, we created you from a single male and a single female, and established you as peoples and tribes that you may come to know one another." Now, you may have heard that verse quoted in interfaith settings. It's often quoted by Muslims as an important ayah encouraging interfaith dialogue, and I think that's an accurate interpretation. But people often stop there and don't go on to read the rest of the verse. Truly the most noble among you is none other than the most God-conscious. Among the many mysteries of human existence hinted at in this verse is that God is responsible for human difference. That human difference is not an accident of history, but instead an outcome of divine providence and design. And not only that, but this difference has been primarily intended not as some kind of sadistic obstacle course to make our lives more difficult, but rather as an opportunity for growth. What kind of growth? Growth in knowledge and awareness of one another, self, and ultimately God, through the process of relational encounter in difference. What's the point of saying the most noble among you is the most God-conscious after the point is made that this great diversity of the human species has been designed so we would have the challenge of coming to know each other, unless it is to suggest that there's a connection between true God consciousness and this process, sometimes exhilarating, sometimes gut-wrenching, sometimes soothing, oftentimes frightening, of coming to know one another. If this is the case, then why are we so afraid of difference? Why do people like us gathered here this afternoon often try, though we may not be aware of it and I'm as guilty as anybody else, to contain it by employing strategies like the sameness platitude? There are many reasons one could offer. The one I'm coming to like the best these days is that we become so attached to the necessary but limited sense of security we get from homogeneity and the familiar, that we erect it as a false idol and lose the capacity to see the inherent beauty and transformative power of the heterogeneous and the strange. It's problematic enough that we do this as individuals in our day-to-day interactions with the world around us. But when we attempt to define ourselves collectively out of fear of difference and exultation in false homogeneity, we run into the problem of becoming agents of oppression and tyranny. We create societies which may rhetorically celebrate unity out of diversity. The motto on the Great Seal of the United States is E pluribus unum, out of many one, but only insofar as the diversity does not challenge the dominant culture and the dominant cultural group or groups which get to shape the narrative of unity in the first place. The people who get to say what the unity looks like. Not everyone gets to say what that unity looks like, unfortunately. In such situations, difference is tolerated, and only to the point where it begins to challenge the dominant narrative of a unity and the power of those who see themselves as the perpetual custodians of that unity. When this happens, the dominant culture and its groups do what they usually do with difference: assimilate it, marginalize it, contain, and if possible, exploit it, exterminate it, or devise some clever combination of the above. There in the U.S., difference is tolerated and even celebrated, but only insofar as it is not perceived to be a threat to the socially constructed whiteness that has been the defining element of the normative American since the beginning. Some would say that the last presidential election cycle is teaching us to see more of the danger of false notions of sameness than of our real differences. But I'm not sure. Lest I leave you with a sober and realistic but somewhat grim picture, let me offer some concluding reflections on two related sources of hope, of the promise of difference: dialogue and education. Why do I call them sources of hope? Because when executed with dedication, integrity, and authenticity, they do not attempt to paper over the differences that make us who we are and in which we root our dignity. Instead, Dialogue and education give us the ability to understand our differences on a level deep enough that we can begin to see the ways in which they complement each other. Is it a coincidence that I've chosen to identify dialogue and education as a source of hope this afternoon in this particular place, in these offices of Affinity Intercultural Foundation? Not at all. In fact, dialogue and education, as many of you are no doubt aware, are two of the signature elements of the mission of Hizmet, the global Muslim spiritual renewal and human solidarity movement that originated over 4 decades ago in Turkey and that has given birth to our host organization, Affinity Intercultural Foundation. In many ways, one could say that the story of Hizmet is a grand and sweeping story of dedication to dialogue and education as a means for transforming individual and collective lives for the sake of the good of the human family. There are many micro-stories I've collected over the 14 years in which I have had the privilege of being involved as a Christian in the Hizmet movement. One in particular stands out for me that I'll just briefly share with you. 5 years ago or so, I was invited by some folks that are part of the movement to give a talk at interfaith iftars that they were sponsoring in South Africa, in Cape Town, in Johannesburg, and Durban. When I was in Johannesburg, I was taken to Soweto, the infamous township of apartheid era South Africa. And by infamous, I'm not talking about the people that are living there, but I'm talking about what the people in these townships had to experience for so long. There's still the same kind of poverty that there was since the official deconstruction of apartheid in South Africa. But I was taken there by my Turkish hosts, who usually go to Soweto to visit parents of the students they serve at the Hizmet Girls' School and Hizmet Boys' School that they have in Johannesburg. I got an opportunity to talk to a group of the boys, and they were very interested in, at the time in Barack Obama, LeBron James, other kinds of things like that, and we talked about that. I talked about what I did at Catholic Theological Union. They were kind of fascinated with that. And after this great exchange, I learned so much from these young men. I asked the principal, I said, back in his office, I said, what, just demographics a little bit. I said, I know most of these young men are from Soweto. I said, but, what's their religious background? And he looked at me and he said, Abi, which is Turkish for my elder brother, my brother. He said, 80% of them are Catholic like you. And I thought to myself, wow. And a tear welled up in my eye. These Turks, there were only about 400 of them at the time in South Africa. I don't know if there are more now, but left their homes, traveled thousands and thousands of miles to open schools with excellent educational values and structures, with a particular emphasis on science and math, to give these young South African, black South Africans, my Catholic brothers and sisters in the girls' school, what they need by way of an education to understand themselves, to understand others, and to change their life circumstances, and maybe those of the many others whose lives they will touch as they go out into the world. Why were these people motivated to do this? These teachers? All sorts of reasons. A lot had to do with the spirituality, teachings, and personal character of a humble Turkish Muslim scholar who has led millions to lives of service, education, dialogue, and relief work all around the world. Many of you know his name. Some of you may be less familiar. Fethullah Gülen, known to folks of the movement as Hoca Efendi, a Turkish term for a teacher one really admires, respects, and dearly loves. One of the central teachings of Fethullah Gülen, at least from my perspective, is that of hoşgörü. Hoşgörü usually gets translated into English in the writings of Fethullah Gülen as tolerance. But it's a problematic translation since tolerance has a kind of minimalist connotation. Hoşgörü comes from two roots in Turkish, hoş meaning good, görmek meaning to see. So it actually means seeing the goodness in others. And think of how this relates to the question of difference. Right? If we're honest with ourselves, we immediately see the difference between ourselves and others. We can even be siblings and we see the difference. Even twins can probably see the difference between oneself and the other twin. Hoşgörü means that in and through that difference, you see the goodness, not despite that difference. Fethullah Gülen writes, quote, "Practice hoşgörü so that your bosom becomes wide like the ocean. Become inspired with faith and love of human beings. Let there be no troubled souls to whom you do not offer a hand and about whom you remain unconcerned." End quote. Hoşgörü is one of the key character traits of what Mr. Gülen refers to as heroes of altruism. It's evident this afternoon in abundance as a movement that is suffering grave human rights abuses and international efforts to crush it in its new homes around the world, even here in Australia, responds by doing what it has always done, reaching out in fellowship and love for greater solidarity in the human family. I'm here this afternoon in part just to share with you my deep and abiding respect for these folks and this movement. They are heroes of altruism, but all of us have that potential, and many of us in this room, I don't include myself, have actualized that to degrees that I wouldn't be aware of. We live in an age in which, like so many ages in the past, the welfare of the human family is threatened by the co-optation of our highest values, and indeed our faith in God, for the pursuit and protection of material gain, the maintenance of societal privilege, and the power such gain gives us over others. The demons of white supremacism, deeply embedded in the DNA of my own country's history, the demons of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia, of hatred of the migrant and stranger, are poised to seduce myself and my fellow country people by these demons' favorite tool, fear. We're all painfully aware of the ways in which religion itself continues to be co-opted in a number of ways, and all too often to stoke fear and to divide us, fear of difference. But even worse, religion is often co-opted into either a complicit silence or a muttering of meaningless ambiguities when it comes to structures of injustice and how these structures stand as the greatest obstacles to the pursuit of shalom, salam, which is not peace in the political science sense, in the diplomatic sense, i.e. absence of conflict, but the true integrated wholeness of all creation. Some religious leaders like Mr. Gülen are not afraid to speak in sorely needed particulars about what the struggle for shalom, salam, must entail in our world today. Pope Francis is one of them. He writes in Evangelii Gaudium these very challenging words. Quote, "Peace in society cannot be understood as pacification or the mere absence of violence resulting from the domination of one part of society over others. Nor does true peace act as a pretext for justifying a social structure which silences or appeases the poor so that the more affluent can placidly support their lifestyle while others have to make do as they can. Demands involving the distribution of wealth, concern for the poor, and human rights cannot be suppressed under the guise of creating a consensus on paper or a transient peace for a contented minority. The dignity of the human person and the common good rank higher than the comfort of those who refuse to renounce their privileges. When these values are threatened, a prophetic voice must be raised." End quote. The thought I want to leave with you this afternoon is something I believe both Pope Francis and Fethullah Gülen would enthusiastically agree upon, albeit perhaps using different language. Ours is this prophetic voice, if only we would deign to use it. Oftentimes we find ourselves spending a great deal of time waiting for governments and the powerful to act in the face of injustice. We also spend a great deal of time asking how to activate the grassroots, never pausing to realize we're all part of the grassroots. If we can turn our foci from waiting to doing, from expectation that it is for others who are more powerful to act, we will never open ourselves to the miraculous ways in which God can act in and through us. So let our prayer be that with God's guidance and grace, we will find, if we haven't already, our own distinctive prophetic calling to promote and enhance social responsibility and live into it fully. Let our prayer tonight be that our loving Creator grant us the ability to see difference, not as a danger, but as a gift we are entrusted to give to one another. Let our prayer be that God bestow on us the courage and fortitude both to give and receive the transformative gift of difference in the dual vocations of dialogue and education. And let us ask for the subtle but critical grace not to become a part of the problem as we seek the solution, not to fall into the trap of demonizing and rejecting the gift of difference, even when offered to us by those who oppose our efforts and see us as their enemies. To God be the glory and honor forever and ever. Amen. Thanks.